Certainly, the kinds of issues that have triggered the Black Lives Matter movement are almost exact corollaries to incidents that triggered riots in the 1960s. Almost always, it was the case of a young black man being killed by policemen under circumstances that didn't seem to most people to warrant that killing. That happened in Harlem in 1964 with that riot. It had actually happened in Harlem in 1943 in a way that triggered a riot.
For tonight, we have Frye Gaillard for his book, A Hard Rain, America in the 1960s, Our Decade of Hope, Possibility, and Innocence. And this is one that I'm particularly interested in because I was a student during the 1960s, so I'm sure that Frye is going to talk about a lot of familiar themes that will harken back to those days. This work has been described by Howell Raines, former executive editor of the New York Times, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, as an essential reading for a time when an American president has willfully ignored the hard-earned lessons from our passage through the most tumultuous decade of social change since the Civil War. A little bit more on Frye. He has written extensively on the Southern race relations, politics, and culture, and currently is the writer in residence at the University of South Alabama. He is the author of more than 25 books, including The Cradle of Freedom, Alabama, and the Movement That Changed America, which won the 2005 Lillian Smith Award for Best Southern Nonfiction.
Thank you. It's really great to be here, and it's such a distinguished forum, and to be part of this, to be talking about a time in our history that I think is filled with lessons and warnings for today, and Robert and I will be talking about that a little bit after some introductory remarks. The 1960s for me was a coming-of-age time. Literally, I went from being in the 8th grade to being a college graduate and beginning a career as a newspaper reporter. But in addition to the sort of chronological accident of growing up in those years, it was a time for me that I had encounters, some by accident and some less so, with figures who were making history and giving a shape to those particularly tumultuous times. I grew up in Mobile, Alabama, in the Deep South, with a part of a white family that was very much part of the Southern status quo. My parents and extended family were certainly not mean-spirited people, but they were people who looked askance at the civil rights movement that was challenging the social norms and the laws that circumscribed the lives of African Americans in our part of the country. And I did my best not to give that much thought. As a kid, I realized I got the message, sometimes explicitly and very often implicitly, that I should just keep my mouth shut when I felt like things just didn't look right. That it seemed like that things just weren't fair, and that there were injustices that affected the lives of people who live not very far away from us. So I was doing what I could not to think about this very much. And when I was 16 in 1963, April of 1963, I went on a high school field trip from Mobile to Birmingham. And it so happened that Martin Luther King was leading demonstrations in Birmingham at that time. And I think I was vaguely aware of this. But again, I had done my best not to give it much thought. But one morning, which turned out to be Good Friday of 1963, a group of us who were on this field trip walked out of our hotel room in downtown Birmingham. And there, as far as from me to the front row here, was Dr. King being arrested. Two very burly Birmingham policemen were shoving him roughly and disrespectfully up the sidewalk toward a police paddy wagon. I wouldn't say they were quite being brutal, There was no real violence, but there was this clear intimation in everything that they said or did with regard to Dr. King that they were trying to inflict as much humiliation as they could in the process of making this arrest. And it caught my attention. I was startled by it. I was a little bit frightened by it. And as they shoved Dr. King along up the sidewalk, one of the policemen had him by the scruff of the collar, and another was holding him by the loop of his belt, and they were shoving him roughly along. And as they passed within 2 or 3 feet of me, I looked into Martin Luther King's face. And I don't know what I expected to see. Maybe anger. I think I would have been angry under those circumstances. Maybe a little bit of fear, because as I said, it was frightening to me to be there as a kid and see this confrontation that seemed to be looming and had the potential for getting worse. But what I thought I saw instead in his eyes, and of course I don't know for sure exactly what he was feeling then, but what I thought I saw in his eyes instead was this kind of deep sadness. Dr. King had large, dark, expressive eyes, and my 16-year-old mind sort of took a picture of the face of Martin Luther King, and the face of Dr. King became, for me, in a way, the face of history. I knew that something was really dramatic and important going on that day, and yet I still didn't know what to make of it. I wish I had. I wish I had known immediately. I wish I could say that I became a racial liberal and a supporter of the civil rights movement from that day forward. But I was confused, and I had a lot to process, and that took a little while. A year and a half later, I went off to college. I got to Vanderbilt University the same year that the first African-American undergraduates arrived at Vanderbilt. And these were extraordinary young people. And there was a lot of conversation on the campus about the issue of race and the issue of civil rights. In addition to that, a student organization called the Impact Symposium brought speakers of its choosing without any supervision from faculty to the campus. And sometimes it felt like the whole world was coming through the campus. And so we got to see people ranging from Stokely Carmichael, the Black Power advocate, to Martin Luther King, to Barry Goldwater, to George Wallace, to Robert Kennedy. And all of that had an impact, I think, on me as well. I began to think about even more deeply and sometimes more personally the things that were going on in the society around us. I remember one particular moment at Vanderbilt from that time. There was a morning where Roy Wilkins, the very intellectual, erudite, articulate head of the NAACP, executive director of the NAACP, was speaking back-to-back with Governor George Wallace, who was at that point at his segregationist worst in terms of the message that he was sending out to the society. And Mr. Wilkins went first, and I don't remember exactly what he said. I just remember the way he said it, and the dignity that he carried as he said it, the way that he talked about the need for changes in laws and customs and the way we lived our daily lives in America. And then Governor Wallace came up, and he gave this kind of snarling address about people interfering with the Southern way of life. And at the end of his address, he called for questions. There were 3,500 people there that morning, and about 5 of them were African American. Young people from Vanderbilt, Fisk, Tennessee State University. And they were sitting together in a small group not too far from the podium. And this one young woman got up to ask George Wallace a question. It took a lot of courage for her to do that at that time. Not so much that she was in physical danger by doing it, but just the discomfort that she felt being outnumbered in a crowd where George Wallace was a speaker was evident in the quiver in her voice as she asked her question. And Wallace, who was a little guy, looked out over the podium at her, And in as mean a voice as I can imagine a public figure using, almost, we have some examples of that today, but in a very mean voice, he looked at her and he said, "What's that, honey? I can't hear you." And he said, she started to repeat her question, and he said, "You're going to have to speak up," cutting her off. And she cleared her throat and did speak up and repeated her question. And again, he interrupted and looked at her with this kind of sneer on his face, and he said, "But you're mighty pretty, though." And the meanness of it was so palpable. And I was sitting next to a friend of mine from Alabama, and he looked at me and he said, "Well, I don't want to be on that guy's side." And that was kind of how it was, in a way, during that time. As some of us were sorting our way through the issues, there were these moments that made us think and feel in ways that we had not before. And so we began to pay attention and began to find our own way to be a part of the changes that were taking shape in the society around us. When I decided to go back and write about this a few years ago, I started thinking about how to do it. And it occurred to me that the decade was defined in some ways, at least this is one way to think about it, with these competing story arcs. One of them being the arc of idealism, the arc of hope, the arc of people who believed that the country could become a better place. That, as we phrased it, some of us in the early 60s, that a great country could become greater, that we had the power of introspection that would enable us to do this. And that was a theme of the decade that I think continued from the beginning of it till the end of it, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But the other story arc was the opposite of that. It was the arc of division, it was the arc of darkness, the arc of violence, the arc of people, really the lesser angels of our nature being evoked by the tumult and the changes of the times, and of course by the shadow of the Vietnam War. I thought I would read just a snippet because I try to tell the bigger story as much as I can through the lives of individual people that I had a chance to interview, that I had a chance to read about, sometimes in primary sources, sometimes in other books that were written. But one group of people that I did have a chance to talk to personally at some length were the young men who staged the first sit-in of the 1960s on February 1st, 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I'm going to read just about a page here about that day and events that led up to it. And hopefully it puts a face on an event that some of us may remember from reading about it. For Franklin McCain, there are moments when the memory of it comes rushing back. The feeling he had when he took his place at the counter on the padded swivel stool beneath the laminated signs promoting lemon pie. He and his friends had given little thought to the history they would be making. They were barely 18, and only much later did they marvel at the mystery of what they achieved. All they knew on this particular day, February 1st, 1960, was that the world was not what they thought it should be. Everywhere they turned, there were whites-only signs and a way of life in the South and beyond that was rooted in the common affront of segregation. As a young black man, McCain got the message, the insult that was never very far from his mind. With Joe McNeil, David Richmond, and Ezel Blair, his three closest friends at North Carolina A&T University, he made a decision so basic and clear that he couldn't believe they hadn't thought of it before. For the sake of their dignity and pride, they simply would not take it anymore. As far as McCain and the others were concerned, the laws of segregation no longer applied. Thus did they make their way on this cold afternoon to the Woolworth's lunch counter, a popular gathering place in downtown Greensboro, and took their seats on the white people's stools. It was the first sit-in of the 1960s, the day the sputtering civil rights movement finally came alive. There had been a victory here and there. The 1955-56 Montgomery bus boycott, for example, which introduced the nation to Dr. Martin Luther King. But in the intervening years, King had struggled over what to do next. He had preached in pulpits across the South and delivered his speeches all over the world, winning acclaim for his eloquence and passion. But the civil rights movement he was seeking to build was so far a series of disconnected events, a caricature of his dreams. Then came Greensboro, where history began in a college bull session. On the night of January 31st, 1960, it was too cold outside, they decided, to go anywhere, so they gathered, as they had many times, in a dorm room shared by McNeil and Blair. McCain and Richmond were there as well. There were just 4 college freshmen talking about the world. Their conversation soon turned to the issue of race, and they began to rail against their parents, who had struggled so bravely to make it in America and urged their sons to do the same. But parents and sons, for no reason other than the color of their skin, were demeaned every day by segregated buses, restaurants, and schools. Why, these young men wanted to know, had the older generation allowed it to happen? Why hadn't they fought back? But then a more disturbing question arose. What had they done? The 4 of them, right there in the room. They talked about the dignity of Rosa Parks and Dr. King, and the heroism of the Little Rock Nine, those remarkable high school students who in 1957 had braved white mobs, eventually with the help of federal troops, to batter the walls of segregation there. But in Greensboro, they themselves had done absolutely nothing. The more they talked, the worse they felt, and their mood sank lower by the hour. I felt dirty, remembered McCain. I felt ashamed. Finally, in the early morning quiet of February 1st, just an hour or 2 before dawn, Joe McNeil looked at the others and demanded simply, "Let's do something." And so they did that afternoon, with no particular planning, no contingency for what might happen if they followed through on their resolve the night before. They went down to the Greensboro lunch counter and took their seats on the segregated area reserved for white people. They had been warned by their parents, as most young African-American men in the South had, not to become the next Emmett Till. Emmett Till had come to Mississippi in 1955 from Chicago to visit his country cousins, and he was surprised to see how frightened they seemed to be toward white people and how deferential they were, and he thought he would show off a little bit, and he said something that may have been mildly fresh to a white woman, and for that, the woman's husband and some of his friends took Emmett out and beat him beyond recognition and threw his body into the Tallahatchie River. All these young men who staged this first sit-in had been warned by their parents that this could happen if you crossed white people in the wrong way, but they did it. And their courage and audacity caught the attention of African-American students and some white students as well all over the South, and within the next 2 weeks there were sit-ins like that in more than 50 communities scattered around the region. In Nashville, probably the best organized group had an advisor whose name was James Lawson. He was African American. He was a United Methodist minister. Lawson had been to India and had studied nonviolence under some of the disciples of Gandhi. But Lawson also thought that the most powerful theological source or energy for the philosophy of nonviolence came from the Judeo-Christian ethic and the Judeo-Christian commitment to the power of love. And so Lawson urged his young sit-in disciples to make a leap of faith with him, a leap of faith that said that love is actually more powerful than hate, than all of the violence and the ill will that was at the heart of segregation in the first place. That's an incredibly audacious leap that they made. Even today, I don't know if I believe that that's true or not, but they believed it in that moment, and their idealism became contagious. And it mixed with other sources of hope and idealism that were important at the beginning of this decade. One of them was a young senator from Massachusetts who was elected President of the United States. And in his inaugural address in January of 1961, he urged us to ask not what our country could do for us, but what we could do for our country. And many people were caught and inspired by that in a way that was rare. When Kennedy began talking about a Peace Corps that would send young Americans to difficult places where people lived on the margins in other countries, people rushed to sign up and volunteer their time. Some people who became involved with the civil rights movement cited Kennedy as much as the sit-in students or Martin Luther King as the inspiration behind the idealism of that decision. But all of these things began to merge, and other streams of change and hope merged with them as well. In 1963, a woman by the name of Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique, and she talked about the unfulfilled lives that many women led in this country. And so women began to search for their voices at the same time, and there were other things that encouraged them to do this. And it became a stronger and stronger sense of the times that many of us had. In August of 1963, Martin Luther King looked out across that crowd of 250,000 people at the March on Washington, and he gave his I Have a Dream speech. It became his great olive branch to the country, the possibility that we could move forward together in hope and justice. But the price of that togetherness would be a kind of equality that the United States had never known in its history. All of that continued as the decade went along, and yet the dark side was part of it too. As early as 1961, you began to see it. The Freedom Riders came to Alabama. The Ku Klux Klan attacked their bus in Anniston, Alabama, and set it on fire and tried to burn the Freedom Riders alive. Almost succeeded in that goal, and would have if there had not been a plainclothes Alabama policeman on the bus who pulled out his gun and made the Klansmen back off enough so that the riders could spill out of the bus, collapsing in the grass on the shoulder of the road outside. There was a family of white people who lived not far away, and they had a 12-year-old daughter. And she saw these people in distress, and irrespective of their color, she brought them water and cold towels, and because of that act of kindness, her family faced such retribution that they had to move away from that part of Alabama. So that was one reminder of how ugly things could be, but we began to see that it wouldn't necessarily be confined to the South. President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965. There began to be riots in the inner cities as African American people grew increasingly impatient with the police brutality that was one of the realities that they lived with every day. There are echoes of that that have been part of our condition in recent years as well, and Robert and I may talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And then over all of this, there was the war in Vietnam. And you had two leaders. You had Lyndon Johnson and you had Ho Chi Minh, who looked at this struggle that was taking shape in this faraway country in ways so utterly different that they didn't know how to talk to each other about it. Johnson saw it through the lens of the Cold War, and Vietnam became a domino that he didn't want to fall, at least not on his watch, because Ho Chi Minh was avowedly a communist, and Johnson assumed that he must be an agent or a sympathizer with the Soviet Union, and therefore in this great global struggle that he knew was being waged, he did not want Vietnam to become, to fall under the orbit of the Soviet Union. But apparently for Ho Chi Minh it looked very different. What he wanted was to get foreigners out of his country. He had tried to do that with the Japanese during World War II and the French in the years right after World War II. And now here were the Americans. And so you had these two leaders in this great global tragedy, and tragedy for both Vietnam and our country, sort of passing like ships in the night, unable to communicate with each other. And so the cost was enormous. 50,000 Americans died, many more were wounded. Our country divided over the war. I remember having a friend of mine from Vanderbilt go to fight in Vietnam because he thought the war was right. He was shot through the spine and paralyzed from the waist down. And conversations when he came home were very difficult. How did he talk to those of us who didn't go? And what did he think about our reasons for not going? Was it really because we disagreed with policy, or were we just cowards? And how did we talk to him about the policy that sent him there without saying to him that we thought he had paid the sacrifice for nothing? And the pain of that conversation and the awkwardness of it became for me a kind of microcosm of the divisions in the country, a sort of personal way of understanding the divisions in the country over this war. And meanwhile, more than 1 million Vietnamese died. But as all of this continued, we saw a couple of people who continued to inspire us. For me, Martin Luther King was one of those. I had followed him closely after that chance encounter in Birmingham when I was 16. I had seen the evolution of his goals from the end of legal segregation to the right to vote for African American people in the South. And then more in the last 2 years of his life, he began to talk about foreign policy and the issues of war and peace and the colonialism and the racism that he thought animated the foreign policy of the United States. And he also began to talk about income inequality and how poverty in a land as rich as ours was simply, in his eyes, a moral abomination. One of his very last speeches was at the National Cathedral in Washington, and he said that one day we will stand before the God of history, and I believe I can hear the God of history say, "You didn't do enough because I was hungry and you fed me not." It was Martin Luther King at his most eloquent, and Martin Luther King at his increasingly radical, because he was calling on the country to do something even more difficult than ending the practices of Southern segregation, to try to find a way to lift the people on the margins of American life into a fuller participation in the American dream. The other person who fascinated me in these years was Robert Kennedy. Raised in Massachusetts, but he had moved to New York and become a U.S. Senator there. In 1968, he was running for president. And he began to talk in a way that I had not ever heard another politician talk about the pain of the lives of people who lived on the margins in our country, whether they were African American, whether they were Native American, whether they were Mexican American farm workers led by Cesar Chavez in California, whether they were children in the Mississippi Delta who still went so hungry that their stomachs were distended and bloated. And Kennedy went to see them and pushed for increases in the food stamp program. All of this he did in a way that attracted a lot of attention among a lot of people. We began to see him urgently, I think, as somebody who could still make things happen and still embody the hopes that we began the decade with. And then in 1968, both Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King were gone. And we were left with a sense of despair. And yet, history didn't stop then, and time didn't stop then, and the decade moved on, and we landed Apollo 11 on the moon and fulfilled the dream that John Kennedy had proclaimed in 1961 when he said we would make it to the moon. And as the astronauts went there, one of the things that they saw and helped us see was something that no human being had ever witnessed before. And that was an Earthrise. That was the Earth hanging alone looking kind of tiny and fragile and beautiful all at the same time against the darkness of space. And they talked from the space capsule about how this was a fragile gift that all of us shared. And so by the end of the decade, the planning of the first Earth Day was underway. It actually happened in 1970. But the idea was being discussed that we had to take care of this place that all of us lived and try to find ways to live in peace. And there was a kind of link in many people's minds between these discussions of equality and ecology and peace. Another thing that happened was that in 3 southern states, in 1969 as it moved into 1970, you had 3 white politicians running for governor of these states: Reuben Askew in Florida, Jimmy Carter in Georgia, Linwood Holton in Virginia, 2 Democrats and 1 Republican, all running on a platform of civil rights, all saying that it was time to put racial bitterness and division behind us. And they all got elected in the South. And some of us who were from the South hoped that we might be seeing in that still a hopeful thing that could happen in the future. Interwoven in all of this were other cultural measures of the times, whether it was music or movies or changes in education or religion. I try to write about some of all of this in the book because one of the things that I wanted to convey was not only what happened but how it felt. We have young historians who are coming along and writing with more detachment about different aspects of those times, and they should do that. There will be insights that go with that. But I wanted them to have at least one sort of geezerly writer to contend with who remembered what it was like and tried to say what it was like. And so that's what I attempted to do in this book. Robert, maybe it's time for you and me to discuss it a little bit more. And then if you guys have questions after that, we'll welcome those too.
And now I'd like to introduce Robert Poulton, who is this evening's moderator. He is a son of the South, as he will talk about shortly. Robert is Vice President of Marketing and Branding, NBC10 Boston, NECN and Telemundo Boston, and a proud member of the Ford Hall Forum Advisory Council. Frye and Robert, thank you.
Great. So, good? Yep. So, Frye, I think you touched on it there. When I read the book, what I was looking for was a recollection. We can all read history, but a recollection of how it felt.
Right.
You know, it's funny, my mom, I know, named me. My name's Robert. She named me after Kennedy.
Oh, wow.
My history
Cool.
my history of this subject is from family members who have told me of, them seeing the Klan ride or seeing crosses burned or what have you.
Right.
So I'm interested really in your perspective, but also how you think that relates to what's going on today. Because as I read the book, there was a lot in there for me that touched on things. I could almost lift the paragraphs out and go, wow, I could have read this today and it
Right.
might still feel true.
Right.
So I think the first thing that struck me was your meeting with, and you touched on it here, your meeting with Martin Luther King, or you're seeing him, and you talked about the dignity and sadness that you saw in his eyes. And I wondered, through your life, clearly that would be one of those moments that you would remember.
Right.
I wonder how often you recollect that and how that's affected the work you've done.
I think it was absolutely pivotal. I think it probably set me on the path to becoming a writer. There was something about it that I could never get out of my mind. I mean, there was something so human about Dr. King in that circumstance. I saw him again a couple of other times in the course of his all too short life. He was only 39 when he was killed. But it was interesting to me. My mind took a picture of what happened in that encounter in Birmingham in 1963. And later, I saw an actual picture of what happened, both a still photograph and a video of that arrest. And it was amazing to me how accurate my mental picture had been. The one inaccuracy was I remembered him as having been wearing overalls, and it wasn't strictly. He had on a blue denim shirt and blue jeans, but it was pretty close, and otherwise it looked almost exactly the same. And I say that because I think it emphasizes how searingly transformative it was to me to see this man who I had already read so much and heard so much about in that kind of vulnerable position where he had to embody dignity and courage in the way that he did. It was really life-changing for a white kid from Alabama.
Sure, I can imagine. So one of the first things I did when I was learned I was going to do this was just to do a little research online, and I had read an article, I believe it was in the Mobile Bay Monthly.
Yeah.
And you talked about, and in fact, I'll just read if you don't mind some of what you
sure.
said. You said, for those of us who grew up with privilege, there's a lot about social justice we need to care about. And I guess I'm always curious to relate the history to now and see what we can learn as we go forward. But when you say that, what do you mean? What do you think? What do you think are the lessons that were there then and that we can also extract and learn now?
Well, for me, I became acutely aware in the 1960s of the privilege that I took for granted as a kid growing up. I was white in a white, well-connected, old Southern family. And so we didn't lack for anything. And it never occurred to me that I wouldn't make it, that I couldn't do whatever I wanted to do. But it did start to occur to me that that wasn't true for everybody and that there was a kind of accident of birth. And then I learned more about my own family and the fact that they were slave owners way back when. And it seemed to me increasingly clear that the effects of those older times had not stopped, that slavery gave way to segregation, which gave way to other forms of racial injustice. And so I've just always thought that that you have to do something about that if you were a beneficiary of it.
How often do you relate that decade to today? Like, it's just in your daily up and about. Are there things you pick out and go, wow, that's different, that's changed, that's evolved, or wow, that is exactly as it was?
Yeah, I think the parallels between the pain of the 1960s and some of the pain of today are remarkable. I began to think about writing this book after I saw what seemed to me to be the astounding racial backlash against President Obama. When Barack Obama was elected president in 2008, I thought temporarily that we had reached a new plateau in this country where such a thing could happen, where a black man could be elected president. And I thought that said good things about how far we had come. And almost immediately, you saw the Republican Party, which in the 1960s, in many ways was as apt to be decent on the issue of civil rights as the Democratic Party in some ways. But you saw the Republican Senate and the Republicans in the House decide that they would try to resist everything that he wanted to do. And then you saw people say that he was born in Kenya or that he was a Muslim. All these things were stupid. There was no reason to say those things except racism, as far as I could see. And so I began to think, we haven't come anywhere, or at least we're losing the ground that I thought we had made, and that was really disturbing to me. The other thing that's disturbing is you had politicians in the 1960s. George Wallace was maybe the first to be really effective at it, who thought that the thing to do about division in the country and disagreement in the country was not to heal it, but to exploit it, and to use division as a way to further their own political aspirations. Richard Nixon, with his Southern strategy, did some of that too and tried to polish it up a little bit. But now that assumption is back with us. It's found a home in very high places. And, you know, Donald Trump, to me, is like, it's like George Wallace was actually elected president in 1964 or 68. Except that George Wallace, later in his life, was sorry about what he had done. And I'm not sure I see that same capacity for introspection today.
You obviously the title of the book from Bob Dylan's song. Just maybe talk about the significance of the Dylan song for you in the book.
Well, music was one of the main sub-themes of the book from the very beginning until the very end of the book. The first reference to music in the book is about how Elvis Presley and Sam Cooke, one of them white, one of them black, grew up 100 miles apart in Mississippi, and each one liked the music of the other. Sam Cooke loved country music, Elvis loved black music, and so forth. To the end of the book, where the last reference to music is Jimi Hendrix playing the national anthem as an electric guitar solo at Woodstock. In between, one of the people that I talk about a lot is Bob Dylan, who was kind of the poet laureate of the decade in a lot of ways. And I thought A Hard Rain was a song that, that in a very poetic, metaphorical way, talked about some of the things that we were apt to face during that time and beyond if we didn't face up to them. It's funny, it took me 2 years to come up with that as the title for the book. Exactly how I missed it the first 2 years is a little bit of a mystery because it sure works. But it was one of those moments where when it occurred to me, it was like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. So that song and others by Dylan were real important.
Right. How long did you talked about Obama? But how long did it take you to write the book? And when did you think when did you think you were going to do it?
I thought that I was going to try to do it about 5 years ago. And I began to read a lot, began to do some research in libraries, began to make notes to myself about things that I would want to cover. And then after that, it was about 3 years of 6-day weeks of writing the book. It took a while to figure out what the structure of it was going to be and how I was going to approach it. But once I decided to, two things. One was to mix a little bit of memoir with a whole lot of history. So it gave it a personal touch and tried to get at how it felt. And the other was the structure of the book, which I decided to make explicitly chronological. And so the book is divided into 60, 61, 62, 63, multiple chapters in each year, but that permitted me to weave various subjects through that storyline as it continued. Once I figured those two things out, then I was able to get started on it, but it was by far the most ambitious thing that I've ever attempted, or I can safely say ever will attempt. There were times that I'm not sure I believed I could really do it. Fortunately, my wife believed I could and told me so, Nancy Gaillard, so that was a big help. But yeah, it was 3 years of constant work.
For you, was that first sit-in the thing that was the catalyst for the 60s? You kind of went through it there, but I mean, you know, there was Emmett Till, there was Rosa Parks prior to that.
Right.
Was that the spark that you think sort of ignited what happened?
I do think that spark was critical if you look at the period of time by decade. You know, it was very early in the decade. It sparked such a widespread movement, all these copycat sit-ins that occurred, and then the leaders of those sit-ins all got together in 1960 and formed a group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so they could talk to each other about the ways to pursue social change. And so the civil rights movement, I think, became immeasurably more cohesive after the sit-ins of 1960. But they didn't come out of nowhere, and the things that happened in the 50s were important leading up to them. And even before that, black soldiers came home from World War II in the 1940s and had fought for a freedom that they really didn't have. And so that sparked a sense of discontent that helped feed what became the Civil Rights Movement. And Harry Truman ending segregation in the military by presidential executive order in the 1940s. All of those things built on each other. But if you look at it as a decade, I think the sit-ins were hugely important.
It's interesting, as I read that section of the book, I thought about them and I thought about myself at their age, thought about my own personal experiences, and I wondered whether or not I'd have the courage to do what they did in that moment. I believe that they said that their anger was stronger than their fear.
Right.
Do you think,
right.
Is that one of the things that you think fueled that decade?
I think it was for a lot of people. I marveled at that kind of courage, certainly when at the time of the sit-ins, but maybe even more for the freedom rides. They got on that bus and they headed into the South, and sure enough, the first bus was attacked, and the second bus, the riders were beaten in Birmingham, and another bus, they were beaten in Montgomery, and yet the buses kept coming. And the thought that there were young people who knew they might get killed, who even wrote out their wills at the age of 19 or 20 or 22 and kept getting on these buses and going to the South. In 1964, for Freedom Summer in Mississippi, the SNCC organizers made the decision that if black people were getting killed fighting for civil rights in the South, and nobody cared, maybe people would care if white kids got killed. And so they invited white students to come to Mississippi and help register voters in 1964. And in the training sessions before they came, they told these students that they might get killed. Turned out that 3 of them did, and yet they came. So there was a kind of courage that became one of the hallmarks of the decade. I can't say that I had it. I watched it. Later, as a newspaper reporter, I was within range of some of the bad guys who were inflicting this kind of violence, but I had nothing but awe toward these folks.
I'm going to ask a couple more questions. I'm going to open it up, and then we'll come back to me. But you talked about Diane Nash and Ella Baker in the book,
right?
And just the role of women in that decade.
Right.
Probably way underrepresented. But can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. Well, there were women in the civil rights movement who did extraordinary things. And they had to push back against some of the inherent sexism of even this movement for social justice. It was a very male-dominated movement, and yet you had Ella Baker and Diane Nash and Septima Clark and Rosa Parks and others who played such important roles and kind of elbowed their way into a position to do that. That became an inspiration more broadly to women generally, I think. You had women like Betty Friedan and those who joined her in 1966 in the founding of the National Organization for Women. And by the end of the decade, you had Gloria Steinem emerging as a feminist with star power, and she wrote a very important article in '69 called After Black Power, Women's Liberation, and the term women's liberation after that became very fashionable. So that was another of the currents of change in the 1960s, that necessarily continues to this day with the Me Too movement and other things.
Yeah. Just, we talked a little bit about it just before we started this, but in the book, you also refer to books like Black Like Me, To Kill a Mockingbird, and to say, I mentioned to you that I had read those books in the 80s, and I know how they affected me. I'm just curious the effect of those books at the time. It seems as though without the social media and the ways that we have to gather information today, there's so much was happening all at once.
Right.
These things probably just all layered on top of each other. But how did you get those messages, and what did you do with it? How did you take it in?
Well, it was really, I always loved to read, and so I read Black Like Me as a fairly young guy in the 1960s, and it was so jarring to read it. I don't know if everybody here has read that, but essentially a white guy posed as being as a black guy for. He thought he didn't know how long he would do it. He tried to go as long as he could, and after 4 or 5 weeks, he couldn't stand it anymore. The insults to the dignity that he had experienced, and he changed nothing about his identity except for darkening his skin temporarily. He was still John Howard Griffin, and he was still a writer, and he was still writing about the American South. And yet, simply by appearing to be a black man, he faced the kind of indignities that made life literally unbearable to him. That was jarring to a white kid reading this. And there were other things that I read during the decade. Michael Harrington wrote a book in 1962 called The Other America that talked about the depth and pervasiveness of poverty in this country. A book that came out of Boston later in the decade by Jonathan Kozol called Death at an Early Age, where he wrote about teaching at an inner city Boston high school. And you know, again, it was jarring to me to think, well, you know, this is it helped me to process the fact that this was in fact a national problem. So, so the books that kept on coming, the autobiography of Malcolm X, hugely important for young people, both black and white, to read in the 1960s, and not only to read the words of Malcolm X, but also the words of Alex Haley, who wrote about Malcolm, because the book is based on Haley's interviews with Malcolm X. Haley was a very different, had a very different perspective than Malcolm X, and yet loved him and understood sort of the humanity of Malcolm X in a way that made him even more real to some of us. So the literature of the 60s was a powerful force.
I'll just read, if you don't mind, I'll just read a little bit, an excerpt from Harrington that's in your book, which struck me, and then I think we'll just open it up to some questions. So, here are the unskilled workers, the migrant farm workers, the aged, the minorities, and all the others who live in the economic underworld of American life. If these people are not starving, they are hungry, and sometimes fat with hunger. For that is what cheap foods do. They are without adequate housing and adequate education and medical care. But even more basic, this poverty twists and deforms the spirit. The American poor are pessimistic and defeated, and the truly human reaction can only be outrage. When I read that in the book, I thought, that's 50 years ago. I could probably read that in a paper today, and it would be what's going on now.
Yeah, the income inequality in the country is worse now than it was then. We had hoped it would be better, but it isn't. It's worse. And we've had, at least since 1980 in this country, federal policies aimed at the upward redistribution of wealth, not the other. And so, and those policies are working just fine. And people on the margins, or even more on the margins, and even the middle class, which was growing and now isn't, you know, you have people working 2 jobs and feeling like they just can't get ahead. So, you know, there's a lot that remains undone that we hope to be done in the 1960s.
We'll open it up now, but I think at the end I'm going to ask you whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. Just looking at the time, like what's...
Yikes.
We'll get to that.
As you did, I experienced all this as a white man.
Right.
And I had no sense of being a people, a part of a people, except as a negativity or except as a difference from those who were not white. The immersion into the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement gave me a sense of being part of a people.
Interesting.
And when I saw on the street or on the bus or by the side of the road someone, another white person, who I could, through observation, understood what I understood, that he was a brother, she was a sister, that sense of being part of a people was the gift that black people, the movement, and the times gave to white people willing to accept the gift, so that when every Martin Luther King holiday we hear the speeches again, and we hear we as a people will reach the promised land, it stirs within us the feelings that it was meant to stir universally. And I think for me, that's the greatest change for white people, that when I see resistance and backlash and backward movement among white people is the greatest tragedy, or one of the greatest to experience. That's just an observation, but I thank you for stimulating it in my mind.
To which all I can say is amen. I mean, I agree. That's a great question, even though it's not a question. I think you're absolutely right. I had the same feeling during those times, and it was the great gift that we received. You know, all of us had to make some kind of decision, I think, about what we felt about what was going on, whether it was civil rights or the war in Vietnam or whatever. And sometimes, if we were open enough, it could be life-changing and transforming to decide what we thought and to honor it. So thanks for that observation.
I'm intrigued by the Innocence Lost as to what was meant there. When I saw it, I kind of associated it with that at the end of the 60s, things ended badly in many respects.
Right.
You had the riots, you had the campus takeovers, you had the Weathermen, the Chicago Convention, a variety of other things which some people associate with the 60s. They don't associate the heroic stuff of the early parts. So anyway, I'm kind of interested in what you meant by the Innocence Lost.
Yeah, some of that you were just talking about, I meant. I also had in mind things like it never occurred to me before November of 1963 that a president of the United States could get assassinated. I mean, I knew Abraham Lincoln had, and I guess I knew that James Garfield had, and so forth. But that was a moment where something that was so full of promise could be taken away from us like that. And so you lose some innocence when you realize that that can happen. And then it kept happening as the decade went along. I think also some of the hopefulness of the movements that young people were a part of gave way to some of what you were talking about, toward an anger that became increasingly destructive, toward an anger that sometimes became self-indulgent. I was on a panel recently in Berkeley, and some of the Berkeley activists from those times were very introspective and reflective about how, in some of their demonstrations, they had kind of thumbed their nose on purpose at the larger populace, and had done things like burning an American flag or whatever. It may be protected as symbolic free speech by the Constitution, but it didn't endear them to the mainstream of American people. And so there was some discrediting of the American left that I think happened during that period of time because of our excesses during that time. So all of that is kind of generally, vaguely what I meant by Innocence lost.
I'm a child of the 60s and also a huge music lover.
Yes.
And I want to commend you on your extraordinary playlist. So for those of you who have Spotify, Frye has created a 58-song Spotify playlist. You've talked about the Jimi Hendrix piece and the significance of A Hard Rain. I've been listening to the soundtrack now for about a week. I've cried. I've laughed. It has brought back extraordinary memories for me. I want you to, if you would, talk about Nina Simone and Mississippi Goddamn.
Sure. 1964, when Nina Simone's song Mississippi Goddamn came out, was a pivotal, hugely significant year in music. It was the year the Beatles came over began the British invasion. One of the things that struck me was how soon after the assassination of John Kennedy it was that the Beatles arrived. And it was interesting because Paul McCartney, who seems to perhaps have been the most reflective of the Beatles, actually talked about that in interviews and talked about the palpable sadness that he sensed in America and shared as even across the waters that this bright young man had been killed. And he hoped in that context that their music would bring some joy, and it did. Motown became big in 1964 as well, and you had the Temptations and the Supremes and the Four Tops and other groups like that. But then you also had, and Nina Simone was part of this, some topical songs that began to appear around that same time. You had Sam Cooke wrote A Change Is Gonna Come. And although it was played on the radio more than Mississippi Goddamn, it was still motivated by the commitment to social change that he was more and more beginning to feel. Johnny Cash had a #2 country hit with The Ballad of Ira Hayes, which was about an American Indian who had been a hero in World War II and had died broken and an alcoholic after he came home from the war, and it was kind of an Indian protest ballad. But there was no song during that time more hard-hitting than Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddamn. Nina Simone actually was born in the South. She was born in North Carolina. But she played that song in a lot of different places, and a lot of people didn't much care for it. Wasn't just in the South that it was controversial. It wasn't just in Mississippi that it was banned. But boy, she laid it out there, and she demonstrated that music could do that. It could speak directly, angrily to the realities in the society as the musicians saw them, and she let it rip.
Your talk certainly brings back lots of memories of a tumultuous time. I'm particularly interested in any application or applicability to current times and sort of thinking about that decade and then thinking about where we are now. And those of us who feel like the country, at least the leadership at the federal level, has lost its way, and lest we forget all the people that put them there. And I wonder if writing this book and looking at all that gave you any hints or ideas of kind of what's the 2019 corollary to freedom riders, or what is,
right.
What does one best do if you think we're in a similar kind of situation and want to take some kind of action?
Yeah. I think that's a great question, and in a lot of ways for me it's the question. When I look at it on a grassroots level, I actually see some reasons for hope, because I think there are some corollaries, whether it's Black Lives Matter or Me Too or the March for Our Lives and those brilliant young students from Parkland who went through this unspeakable tragedy, and I remember the image of Emma Gonzalez, the very bright young woman with the buzz-cut hair, speaking. Was it here? Was she in Boston? Washington. She was in Washington? Okay, yeah. because I know there was a march that day in Boston as well. But speaking and having the instinct to make her speech last exactly as long as the shooting lasted in Parkland, tears running down her face as she named the students who had died in Parkland, and they had this sort of outreach of discussion with kids from a place like Chicago, whose experience with shooting was less a matter of mass shooting as it was of daily shooting, and trying to understand the similarities and differences of experience and make sure that there was some cross-cultural understanding. Remains to be seen how far all that will go or how long it will last. But I found myself thinking of the young people who sat in the sit-ins, and certainly the kinds of issues that have triggered the Black Lives Matter movement are almost exact corollaries to incidents that triggered riots in the 1960s. Almost always it was the case of a young black man being killed by policemen under circumstances that didn't seem to most people to warrant that killing. That happened in Harlem in 1964 with that riot. It had actually happened in Harlem in 1943 in the way that triggered a riot. So that kind of recurring thing is something that strikes me as an important and depressing, really, parallel between those times. One of the things I recently toured the Equal Justice Museum in Montgomery. If you ever have a chance to get down there, go to that museum. It traces the racial history of the country from slavery to the inequities of our current criminal justice system, and kind of sees an arc or a through line from those times and sees a connection between those times. One of the things they took notice of was that I believe it was in 2015, an average of 2 a week, unarmed black people were killed by policemen at a rate of 2 a week for that particular year. That was the same average as the number of black people who were lynched in a 50-year period beginning in the late 1800s on through the 1940s. Is that coincidence? Or if so, it's a chilling coincidence, or is it worse? So I think these are the questions that we're left with. I think the 60s helped maybe focus some of these questions for today. What I don't see in the analogy of those times is who is Robert Kennedy today? So I worry about that.
I think that was one of my questions I was going to ask you. Is you talked about better angels. I wonder who you think those better angels are today. Could be.
Well, I think there are a lot of people. I think the better angels of the American character are alive and well in millions of Americans. I do think that, and I do think that there's reason to hope. And I think there are politicians who want to do the right thing. I think that having the instinct for how to talk to people in a way that both animates our better angels, but also reaches across the barriers to people who may not share all of the assumptions that we share. How do we talk about what we believe? How do we convey to people that everybody having medical care is not so much a radical idea as it is, it's so obviously necessary. The opposite of that is so obviously unfair that should be unthinkable. But how do we get that across? And who is there out there with the eloquence and the wit and the bravery to get that across on a mass scale?
I know I could just ask you this after we leave, but one of the things that I've been thinking as I've been listening to you talk is the role of women moving forward, and maybe especially women of color, and that this is a place where where I think that's the voice that we need. I think that's the place that the next Kennedy kind of leadership comes from, because it's a voice that has been missing. And I think when you talk about somebody like Emma Gonzalez, or we look at not only the leadership, but some of the voices that came out of the Women's March.
Right.
How you think that kind of space might be created now, because I think that especially when we talk about these kind of humanitarian ideas of feeding people, of making sure everybody has medical care, of making sure people can go to school, women are really good at this stuff.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and women of color who have lived in a situation that white people cannot possibly imagine, I think are the ones. So I wonder if you can just speak to that.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. And we've seen some women of color step forward and run for office and do a really fine job. I mean, Kamala Harris is certainly a very promising politician and presidential candidate. Stacey Abrams in Georgia, I thought ran a very powerful campaign. In my own home state of Alabama, it wasn't a candidate, but women of color were hugely important, if not definitively responsible for the fact that we elected a moderate Democrat, Doug Jones, to the U.S. Senate a couple of years ago. That to me was something, a kind of rare moment of pride for my home state when we elected Doug Jones. He was, after all, the prosecutor that put away the Birmingham church bombers. And the fact that he's our U.S. Senator, I don't always agree with him, but I often do. But he would not have been elected without the African American vote, and in particular, the African American women's vote. But I think that could become an even more openly present force in the country as these women take their places, and they have been doing that for a while. I mean, they were important in the civil rights movement, and you had Shirley Chisholm come along in the late 1960s, and a whole string of powerful black women have come along since then. But the more the merrier.
I was young during the 60s, but was a beneficiary of many of the things that took place then. Today, one thing we see with social media is that there is an element of connectivity that transcends national borders, particularly in movements. But during the 1960s, some of that international consciousness was very much in place, and we see that in 67 with King's Riverside speech about Vietnam. We see it in other ways as nations in Africa were breaking colonialism. Could you say something about how that increased consciousness of this being a global battle affected you, or was part of what you were aware of?
Yeah, that's a really significant point. And for me, it was not something that I had grasped until maybe 1968. And then you had revolutionary things happening in Czechoslovakia that year. You also had the famous Black Power salute at the Olympics of 1968. And with a little more reading, I discovered that there were things going on in Mexico where those Olympic Games were going on that were very important during that time. And as you said, there was the colonial, throwing off colonialism in Africa, and that was well underway. And you had, Malcolm X wanting to make common cause with people overseas, and Stokely Carmichael later, but also people like John Lewis, who was resolutely nonviolent, but used the word freedom fighter to describe people like himself in the American South, and wanted to connect with freedom fighters in other places. You had Robert Kennedy going to South Africa in a very iconic trip that he made in 1966, and not only going to the Soweto ghettos and that kind of thing, and making speeches to black crowds from the top of a car, and giving his moral support to the energy that was moving against apartheid. But he also had the instinct about how to reach white South Africans too, and to talk to them not so much as with finger pointing and scolding, but to say, we're all capable of recognizing each other's humanity. And so you had white South Africans writing about how they felt more liberated to be decent because this man had come. So, there was this interplay of energy and ideas from one continent to the other. And I write about that some in the book, but thank you for bringing it up, because it's very important. And certainly it is today as well.
It's my daughter's going to ask a question.
Yay, good.
Hi, so I was born in Georgia, and we recently moved to Boston, Massachusetts.
Right.
And I wanted to ask you, have you realized any differences between the South and the North regarding racism? Because I just want to say that I was in Georgia for at least, I think, 12 or 13 years. We moved here last year,
Right.
and I never once had been called a racial slur. I was never, discriminated against, but coming to Massachusetts, I've encountered numerous racial issues regarding different students, teachers, and I just want to ask you, do you think there's a difference between the racism in the South and the racism in the North? Because normally people here say the South is racist, but I've experienced racism here as well.
That's really interesting. I do, anecdotal experiences like that vary. I think racism is certainly a national problem. It's the original sin of our whole country. I used to think that maybe we had occasion in the South because our sins were the most obvious, to address them more explicitly than in other places, perhaps. I'm less confident of that now. I sometimes sense a lot of backsliding in the South, but I'm happy to know that your experience growing up in the South was what it was and what it should be, right? I mean, that's the least we should expect of wherever we live, and yet the fact that it's not universally true wherever we find those kind of things means that we've got a lot more work to do. I often think that racism is one manifestation of the fact that whenever people live in proximity and they're not exactly alike, we have to, that's the frontier of human experience in a lot of ways. And we have to find a way in a shrinking world and in a democracy like ours to understand our common humanity and to respect our differences. And it's not easy, but it is possible. And we just have to keep working at it. I don't think we ever get to a place where it's solved, but I thought we had reached plateaus where we couldn't go backwards in certain ways. And I'm less sure of that now. And so we just have to keep moving forward. As a generalization, I've seen racism in both places. And so I don't know for sure where it's worse, but I'm sorry for what you've experienced here, and hopefully that will not be the case for very much longer. Thank you for your question, though.
Just to add, I think that every once in a while things come along to give us a measure of where we truly are.
Right.
And I think that we experience, this might be one of those times perhaps, but I think we can be lulled into a sense that things are better than they are. And I think sometimes the mirror gets put up and tells us where we are.
Yep.
Hi. Could you say something about the role of media? It seems to me that the media then, in the 60s, was more shared, and there was less opportunity for entrenchment in, in personal views. And, like TV and radio and stuff, everybody watched it. The books you were talking about, we all read them.
Yeah.
Anyway, could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think, to me, you're absolutely right about that. We all watched the same networks. We all trusted Walter Cronkite. We reasoned from the same set of facts, really. We might disagree about what they meant, but we didn't disagree so much about what they were. I guess there are pros and cons where that's concerned. I mean, generally speaking, I'm in favor of democracy and more voices being aired. But on the other hand, it's so splintered now, from cable news to the internet. And so it's possible to not talk to each other very much, but to talk past each other now in a way that's a little bit scary to me. I do think some of our national media are working hard now to tell the story of our very troubled times. I'm proud of the work that, at least since the election, that the New York Times and the Washington Post and others have done. I think some of that is journalism at its finest. It's going to take that kind of bravery as we move forward, because after the Attorney General Barr's summary of the Mueller report, there's a lot of aggressiveness in very high places now toward the media and toward critics. And we have to have media and we have to have critics. I think in these times especially, but in any time, we need that. So, we do live with a different media today, and I don't know how to fix that or how to adjust it. I just think we all have to look for ways, even if it's a crowd this size, to talk to each other and open ourselves to each other's views. And glad the TV folks are here recording all of us, and people can think what they want about it. And we just have to keep trying to talk to each other and find a way to do it.
Just, as someone who's worked in media for a while, I think we all just have to look for different sources. We can't all rely on the same things. And we do absolutely have to talk to each other. I think that's something we absolutely have to do. Last question for me, and it's just the optimist-pessimist thing. Reading through the book, I thought to myself, wow, there's a lot that happened there. And a lot of it is, I could read that book today.
Yeah.
Where are you, 50 years later? Where do you think? Where do you think we are, and what do you think the future is?
I'll have a lot clearer answer in November of 2020.
Okay.
I end the book by saying that there were these two parallel streams in the 1960s, the idealism and the hope, and the division and the tragedy. And they've both continued to flow through the lifeblood of this country. And I posed the question late in the book, which of them is stronger? Which was stronger then, which is stronger now? And my very helpful conclusion that I offer in the book is, I don't know. So, ask me on a given day whether I'm an optimist or a pessimist, and you might get a different answer.
I'll call you in November next year.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you so very much, Robert, for your stellar moderating of this evening's program. Frye, thank you so much for your